Lamech looked at his newborn son and felt something close to terror. The child was wrong. His skin was too pale, whiter than wool. His hair was like white snow. And when the infant opened his eyes, the whole room seemed to fill with light, as though the sun had been folded into the body of a baby. Lamech had heard the stories. He knew what had been happening in those years. The Watchers had come down out of heaven. They had taken human women, and the children born from those unions were not fully human. So Lamech looked at this strange, radiant boy and asked the only question that mattered. Whose son is this? He went to his own father, Methuselah, and he said, "This child does not belong to me. He belongs to the angels." Methuselah had no answer of his own, so he traveled to the ends of the earth to find the one man who might. His grandfather, a man who had walked with God and never died, Enoch. And the answer Enoch gave is the reason this video exists. Because Enoch did not say the child was cursed, he said the opposite. He said this child is the one who will survive what is coming. This child is proof that the line held. The Book of Enoch describes a deception so complete that almost no one alive will see through it, but it also describes a group of people who cannot be fooled by it. And, according to the text, that resistance is not something you learn or earn or study your way into. It is something you are born with. It runs in families. And before we go further, I need to pause for a second, because what I'm about to tell you gets significantly darker. And I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete reconstruction of the passage Enoch left about the bloodline that cannot be deceived, the full description of the deception that is coming, the mark Enoch says separates the elect from everyone else, the exact genealogy the text traces from Seth to Noah. Name by name, I put it all into a written document. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now let's continue. To understand why that claim matters, you have to understand what the Book of Enoch actually is, and why you almost certainly grew up never hearing about it. Enoch is one of the oldest religious texts in existence. The core of it, the section scholars call the Book of the Watchers, is old enough that parts of it may predate most of the Old Testament in the form we now read it. For centuries it circulated freely among Jews and among the earliest Christians. People read it out loud. Scribes copied it by hand. It was quoted as authority by those who stood at the very beginning of the faith. And then it vanished from the Western Bible almost completely. By the time the Christian canon hardened into its final shape, Enoch had been pushed to the outside. The Western Church did not carry it forward. For most of the last 1,500 years, across Europe, the book was effectively lost, remembered only as a name in a few old arguments. What kept it alive was a single, stubborn tradition. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church never let it go. They preserved the entire text in Ge'ez, their ancient liturgical language, in manuscripts guarded inside stone churches on a high African plateau. While the rest of the Christian world forgot Enoch had ever existed, Ethiopia went on reading it as Holy Writ, week after week, century after century. That is why nearly every complete copy of Enoch in the world traces back to Ethiopia. In 1773, a Scottish traveler named James Bruce carried 3 Ge'ez manuscripts out of the country and back to Europe, and the Western world met the Book of Enoch again for the first time in more than 1,000 years. Then came 1947. In caves above the shore of the Dead Sea, near a ruin called Qumran, a shepherd and then a small army of archaeologists found the scrolls that would rewrite biblical scholarship from the ground up. Among those scrolls were fragments of Enoch. Not a single copy. Multiple copies, written in the original Aramaic, older than anything Europe had ever laid eyes on. The book the Western Church had quietly dropped was sitting in those caves in numbers that rivaled the books that stayed inside the Bible. Whoever hid those scrolls 2,000 years ago clearly thought Enoch mattered. They thought it mattered enough to protect alongside Genesis and Isaiah, wrapped and sealed and hidden from whatever was coming. And here is the detail that should stop you cold. The New Testament itself quotes Enoch directly. In the short letter of Jude, near the very end of the Bible you probably already own, the author names Enoch by name and quotes his prophecy about the Lord coming with 10,000s of his holy ones to bring judgment. A book supposedly too strange, too dangerous, too wild to include, is quoted as genuine prophecy inside a book that made the final cut. The early Christian writer Tertullian defended Enoch openly. He argued that it should be kept, that it had been rejected by some only because they could not stomach what it said about the angels who fell. Others, men like Augustine and Jerome, pushed hard in the other direction, and in the end their side won the argument for the West. But the fight itself tells you everything. This was never a book that nobody took seriously. It was a book that serious men fought over, precisely because of what it claimed. And to see what it claimed, you first have to see the shape the claim is built on, which is hidden in a part of the Bible most people skip. The 5th chapter of Genesis is a genealogy, a long chain of names and ages that readers tend to glide right past. But that chain is the spine of this entire story. It lists a single, unbroken line of 10 men running from the beginning of the world down to the flood, first Adam and then his son Seth. From Seth came Enosh, and from Enosh came Kenan, then Mahalalel, then Jared. Jared fathered Enoch, the 7th from Adam, the one who did not die but was taken. Enoch fathered Methuselah, who outlived every man in the record. Methuselah fathered Lamech, and Lamech fathered Noah. 10 names, one line, running like a thread of gold, through a world that Enoch says was falling apart around it. This is the line the whole book is quietly guarding. Everything else in Enoch, the fallen angels, the giants, the forbidden knowledge, the coming judgment, happens around this thread. And the entire drama of the text is whether the thread will make it through, intact and uncorrupted, to the one man on the far end who can carry it across the water. So, what was falling apart? The heart of Enoch is a story that Genesis only hints at in a handful of verses. Genesis mentions, almost in passing, that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and took them as wives, and that there were giants in the earth in those days. 4 verses, that is all Genesis gives you before it moves on. Enoch gives you the entire account. According to the text, 200 angelic beings called the Watchers descended to the earth on the summit of Mount Hermon. They bound one another with a shared oath, so that no single one of them could turn back or inform on the rest. Their leader was named Shemaiah, and they did 2 things that changed the human race forever. First, they took human women and fathered children with them. And those children were the Nephilim, beings of enormous size and endless hunger, who devoured everything the earth could produce and then began to devour people. Second, and this is the piece that matters most for us, they taught. They handed humanity knowledge it was never meant to hold. A watcher named Azazel taught men how to forge swords and knives and shields and the whole machinery of war. He taught the working of metals out of the ground. He taught women the use of cosmetics and the art of appearance, the craft of making a lie look beautiful enough to believe. Others taught sorcery, the cutting of roots, the casting of spells, the reading of the stars, the meanings hidden in the signs of the sky. Read carefully, and you notice that Enoch never treats this as human progress. It treats it as corruption poured directly into the species. The knowledge was real. That was exactly the danger. It worked. Metallurgy works. Weapons work. Astronomy and the manipulation of appearance and the reading of omens all work well enough to build a civilization on. And that is the trap the book is describing. The deception does not arrive as an obvious lie that any fool could reject. It arrives as something useful, something impressive, something that makes the person who accepts it feel more capable and more advanced than the people who refuse it. It pulls humanity away from what is true, one useful secret at a time, until an entire world has been rebuilt on a foundation that no one alive can even remember questioning. That is the mechanism, not force. Seduction. A slow, generation by generation trade of truth for power dressed up the whole way as wisdom. And the more advanced a civilization becomes on that foundation, the harder it becomes to question the foundation at all. The knowledge stops feeling like a choice anyone once made, and starts feeling like the floor under everyone's feet, simply the way things have always been. That is the exact state Enoch says the world had reached right before the flood, and it is the state the book warns the world will quietly drift back into right before the end. Now hold that idea firmly, because Enoch refuses to leave it buried in the ancient past. The book pivots and turns forward in time. It describes the judgment that falls on the Watchers, and then it does something genuinely strange for a text this old. It looks ahead to a final generation. Enoch describes an age at the very end of the story when the deception comes back. Not swords this time, something quieter and far harder to see. A darkening of understanding, where truth is buried under such a mountain of things that merely look like knowledge that almost no one can dig it back out. An age where the exact pattern the Watchers began, making the lie beautiful, making corruption feel like sophistication, reaches its full and final flowering. And the book warns that in that age, most of humanity will be carried along by it and will not even feel it happening, because a deception that everyone shares stops looking like a deception at all and starts looking like the world. That is the deception the title of this video points to. But here is the turn. Enoch does not say that everyone falls. Again and again the text names a group it calls the elect, the righteous, the chosen ones. People who are described as seeing clearly while everyone around them cannot. People the deception simply fails to take hold of. And the question the entire book circles back toward is this one: what makes them different? Before we move on to the next passage, stop for a second. What you just heard about the righteous seed and the line that was protected is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the original Ge'ez account. The preserved line, the inherited discernment, it's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back, because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. The answer Enoch gives is not the flattering one most people would guess. It is not that the elect are cleverer than everyone else. It is not that they read more, or studied harder, or happen to find the right teacher at the right moment. Enoch ties the difference to lineage, to a line of people carried down through the generations, kept separate, kept intact, protected from the very beginning of the world. Go all the way back to the start of the human story, and you find that Genesis actually gives you 2 family trees descending out of Adam, not one. The first runs through a son named Cain, the first murderer, the man who killed his own brother in a field. The second runs through a son named Seth, born afterward, described in the text as being in the image and likeness of his father. 2 lines from one origin, and Genesis follows them in 2 completely different directions. The line of Cain builds the first cities, forges the first weapons, and produces the men remembered for violence, for pride, for boasting openly about the people they had killed. The line of Seth produces something else entirely. It produces the men who, the text says, first began to call on the name of God. And it is straight down the line of Seth that you arrive at one particular name, Enoch himself. The 7th from Adam, the man who walked with God and was taken up without ever tasting death. Enoch was not some random desert prophet. He was a specific link in a specific chain. And that chain did not end with him. It ran on through his son Methuselah, and then to Lamech, and then to the strange bright child who opened this video, Noah. There is a passage deep inside Enoch that makes this idea almost impossible to miss once you have seen it. It is sometimes called the Apocalypse of Weeks, and in it Enoch lays out the whole of human history as a series of periods, like weeks on a calendar stretching from creation to the final judgment. And in one of those early weeks, the text says, something is chosen and set aside. It uses a phrase that has haunted readers for 2,000 years. It speaks of the plant of righteousness, an eternal plan of righteousness that is elected and preserved out of the corruption of the world. A seed, a living line, planted early and guarded through every age that follows, from which the righteous of the very last generation will eventually spring. That is not vague spiritual poetry floating free of everything else. It is the same idea as the genealogy in Genesis, told in the language of prophecy, a chosen seed, a protected line, something planted at the beginning specifically so that it can still be standing and still be recognizable at the end. Enoch is telling you that the resistance to the deception was built into a lineage on purpose, and that the lineage was meant to last all the way down to a reader who would need it. Notice too where Enoch himself sits inside that line. He is the 7th from Adam, and in the numbering of the ancient world the number 7 was never a throwaway figure. It stood for completion, for something brought to its full and finished form. The 7th name in the chain is the one man lifted out of ordinary human death altogether and carried straight into the presence of God, then sent back down with a warning for everyone who would follow. That is the text telling you, in its own quiet way, that this line was not merely surviving by luck, it was being selected, marked at specific points along its length. Set apart, and then set apart again, from within itself, one chosen man, standing at the exact center of a chain that runs from the first human being who ever lived to the very last one who ever will. The elect, in Enoch, are never described as people who happen to stumble onto the truth by accident. They are described as people who were known and named and set aside before they had drawn a single breath, for a purpose that would not become clear until generations after they were gone. This is where the 2 great threads of the book finally braid together into one. Remember why Lamech was so afraid. He looked at his newborn son and thought the child might be one of them, a child of the Watchers, corrupted at the root, born already belonging to the thing that was destroying the world. And Enoch's answer, carried back through Methuselah, was that the boy was clean. The line had held. Whatever had happened to the rest of the human race, whatever mixing and corruption had gotten into so many other bloodlines, this one thread had come through untouched. And that is exactly why Noah, and no one else, is the man chosen to survive the flood. The Bible states it in a single loaded sentence. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. That word, generation, is not there for decoration. In the underlying Hebrew, it reaches toward his origins, his descent, the stock he came from. The verse is telling you that Noah was not only good in his behavior, he was, in his very lineage, whole, uncorrupted at the root. And when the waters rose to scrub a world that had been completely overrun, it was that one intact line that God carried through the flood inside a wooden box, and every human being alive on the planet today descends from what came out the other side. The deception, in Enoch's account, works by corruption. It gets into the line, and the ones who resist it are the ones in whom the line was kept clean. But the flood does not actually end the story, and Enoch is careful to tell you why. When the Nephilim, the giant children of the Watchers, were destroyed in the flood, their bodies died. Their spirits did not. The text says plainly that the spirits that came out of those dead giants remained on the earth as unclean spirits, restless and hungry and hostile, and that they went on working against humanity long after their bodies were gone. This is the hinge that connects the ancient world to the final one. The corruption did not drown with the giants. It changed form. The physical deception, the giants and the forbidden crafts, gave way to something invisible and far more patient, a spiritual pressure working quietly through the ages toward that last generation Enoch warned about. So the same battle that Lamech was living through, the terror over whether the corruption had reached his own house, is not a battle that ended thousands of years ago. In the logic of the book, it is the same battle still running now, wearing new clothes. And the same line that survived the water is the line that is meant to survive the last deception too. So when the text says that certain people are born unable to be fully deceived, this is what it actually means. It is not describing a magic gene you could someday find under a microscope. It is describing inheritance in the deeper, older sense the ancient writers were reaching for. Something passed from parent to child that is more than blood, and yet seems to travel the very same paths that blood travels. Call it a disposition bent toward the truth, a built-in allergy to the beautiful lie. Enoch describes the elect as people who were, in a sense, marked from before their birth, known and set apart inside a line that had already been set apart from the rest of the world. And the way that resistance actually shows up, both in the text and arguably in the world you can watch with your own eyes, is familial. It clusters. It repeats. You will recognize it if you look honestly at the people around you. The stubborn instinct that something is wrong even when every voice in the room insists it is fine. The refusal to be swept up by the thing sweeping up everyone else. The strange, quiet pullback toward what is real when the whole culture is leaning the other way. In the framework Enoch is working inside, that is not a personality quirk or an accident of temperament. It is the fingerprint of the line. It surfaces in families because a family is exactly where it was always designed to travel. A grandfather who could never be fooled. A mother who saw straight through people. A child who, without ever being taught how, simply would not swallow the lie that everyone else swallowed whole. Now, it is worth being honest with you about what we are doing in this video. Enoch is an ancient text, and reading a modern idea like inherited discernment back into it is an act of interpretation, not a laboratory proof. No one can hand you a genetic report that isolates a bloodline immune to deception. What the text genuinely gives us is a pattern, stated in the vocabulary of its own distant age, a corruption that spreads by descent, a line deliberately kept apart from that corruption, a final generation in which the very same battle is fought one last time. Whether you take that literally, as a real physical lineage preserved across thousands of years, or as a picture of something spiritual that runs even deeper than genetics ever could, the shape of the claim does not change. Some people are carried helplessly along by the deception of their age, and some people, by their inheritance, are simply immune to it. And maybe that is a large part of why the book was quietly left outside the walls of the canon in the first place. A story about angels and giants is unsettling, but it is safe because it stays locked in the ancient past, where it cannot touch anyone. A claim that there is a line of people alive right now who cannot be governed by the reigning deception, who by their very origin see through what everyone else has agreed to accept, is not safe at all. That is a claim with sharp consequences in the present tense. It quietly tells a certain kind of person that the thing they have always felt, that lifelong sense of not quite belonging to the consensus, of standing just slightly outside the thing everyone else takes for granted, might not be a flaw in them at all. It might simply be an accurate description of who they are and where they come from. And if any of this has been landing a little too precisely for comfort, that reaction is worth sitting with instead of shrugging off. The people this book was written for were never the crowd. They were the outliers. The ones who felt, often from early childhood, like they were watching the world through a slightly different window than everyone around them. The ones who could not force themselves to believe a thing simply because believing it was easier, or more popular, or more rewarded by the people in charge, Enoch would not call that isolation. Enoch would call it inheritance. The book keeps insisting that the ability to stand apart from a deceived world is not some random burden dropped on a handful of unlucky people for no reason. It is a trust, handed down along a line on purpose, from one generation to the next, waiting each time for the person who would carry it a little further before passing it on again. Enoch does not end in despair. It ends in a strange, steady confidence. The watchers are judged. The corruption is real and it is vast, but the book insists it is not the final word over anything. The elect will be preserved through the very worst of it, the same way one clean line was once preserved through a flood that took everything else. A righteous generation will stand at the end of history, and will not be deceived, because of what they carry inside them, and the text leaves that promise deliberately, almost tenderly, for a reader far in the future. Enoch was taken up without dying, the story says, kept alive and set aside precisely so that he could one day warn a later age. He was writing for people who would live long after him, in a time when the deception had returned in full strength, people who would desperately need to be told that the resistance they felt inside was not madness and was not weakness. It was memory. It was the line, still holding. So think one more time about Lamech, standing over that strange, glowing child, convinced that the corruption had finally crept into even his own house. And think about the answer he was given. The child is not what you fear. The child is what survives. Every single person watching this video right now is descended from that child. The line that came through the flood is your line. The only question Enoch leaves in your hands is whether, in this generation, in your family, in you, it is still holding. And whether you might be one of the ones it was kept alive for all along. Because the line does not carry itself. In every generation, it needs one who refuses to let it perish.